With my inevitable crunch time project of Starfield coming up, lots of hype is being generated in many areas except one, that being the world design. I know. Clown World. 1000 Dead, Proc Gen Worlds, etc. The whole torrent reminded me of a game I almost played a while ago, but lost out to RDR2, Death Stranding. I played a couple hours of both and decided Red Dead was the better pick. It happens. But I did like what Death Stranding was putting down, and I always did want to loop back to it. It's weird and experimental, but it's also just fun, which is important. RDR2 is also fun, but it wasn't experimental or weird. The problem is that the popular image of the game is, well, just the weird part.
Land and bridges falling down.
I might be able to piece together a little more of the puzzle.
Me, I'm no exception.
However, that's not really what this game is. Trying to summarize this game really is a mess of loaded terms. Even calling it experimental might turn off some people who'd actually really enjoy it. Let's start with this. Paths you take repeatedly actually change the areas you pass through. Then, if you don't take those routes in a while, those paths recede. Other players can contribute to this process, and you can have the option to work with friends on this. But none of this is present the first time you go through an area, and you can opt out of community contributions entirely if you wish. Now when I heard this, I thought, well, gee, so other people can establish a meta in my single-player game? If I didn't play it at launch, I might as well never play it. Which was a mistake. Actually, there were a lot of assumptions I made due to the difficulty people have with even explaining how a lot of this stuff works. Except for ziplines. Those were exactly as game-breaking as I thought they were going to be. Where this intersects with Starfield is that I want to talk about mobility mechanics and world exploration and various assumptions people have about game world design, which means I'm not going to talk about the story. I don't have the time, plus I need to keep it positive, so those commenters who complain every video that I hate all games have to be a little more creative. I don't hate all games, I just hate 90% of them, and yes, your favorites are all on my worst games ever list. Death Stranding has many moments where you get a nice vista as an introduction to a new area. You know, this used to be a special thing games would do. Now everyone chases this high despite how diluted the idea is because of, well, open world games. But I'll ask you this, how often do shots like this actually excite you? Me personally, very, very rarely. It's always tied to how much cooperation the gameplay designers and world designers had in development. World design is a specific discipline of game design that focuses on the physical world that a game, usually open world, takes place in. It's related to, but has different focuses than level design. There is an interesting inverse proportion to Bethesda games. As time has gone on, their world design has really only improved. I know saying Fallout 76 is the peak might be a little controversial to those who haven't played it, but it's kinda all that game is going for it. But as with all inverse proportions, if something's gone up, then something else has to go down. And for this, that would be mobility mechanics. On the flip side, you have Morrowind. Great mobility mechanics, and 95% of the map can be visited without engaging in any of them. Seriously, Morrowind's mobility systems placed even as early as Oblivion, let alone Skyrim or Fallout 76 would be amazing. It's because later Beth games actually impede you from going in a single direction and feature a lot more verticality than Morrowind, which, well, I'll remind you, is supposed to center around a giant mountain. Morrowind's level design is a totally different topic, though. Here's how world spaces in games typically work. You have a two-dimensional plane with deviations created to represent various geographic features, and then landscape pieces placed upon that plane. But at its core, a game world is largely just a piece of paper contorted to look like it has geological history. Death Stranding is no different, because the problems aren't with the worlds, it's the mechanics. So what exactly is Death Stranding doing right? Well, let's use one of those loaded terms that describes this game. Death Stranding is a walking simulator. Walking sims are one of those terms that ended up being an insult due to many of the genre's seminal works being fairly lazy indie solo projects from made-up places like Toronto. If you want to say a game is boring because it has a lot of stretches of walking around but are self-conscious about saying things that other people have said, you might instead opt to say the game is a walking sim. That's not really what Death Stranding is. It's almost as though the designers saw that discourse going on and asked, okay, but can we make that walking simulator idea interesting? That designer being, Hideo Kojima. Yeah, flashbang name if there ever was one. Kojimbo gets it a lot just because a lot of his games are, well...
It's like a movie. Actually, my involvement is nothing.
And there's a vintage for this channel. Problem is, Kojima isn't just a washed-up Hollywood wannabe Westaboo. He's also a game designer by trade, and he does actually design those projects that he then set dresses with, you know, various actresses and film directors he wants to hang out with. And I do think that component of him getting worse with time did hold Death Stranding back, which is unfortunate. But there are sequences where it works, and it makes sense why people like this stuff. And there are other sequences that are abominable, and look, I said I wasn't going to talk about it, okay? Death Stranding is a game where you walk, and walk, and walk. I mean, there are other modes of transportation, but it's all progression, and there are pros and cons, and oh my god, options. But here's where people get messed up, depending on what kinds of games they've played. I mean, how engaging can a game be where you just walk? And honestly, it depends on how patient you are. If not very, Death Stranding can be a challenge. But in a typical game, you just point the camera and go forward. Unless there's a physical object you can't climb over, you can just keep going that direction. Think tying down a joystick with a rubber band. So, for most gamers, walking around is considered the boring parts of games. Death Stranding's designed to be more methodical. Clambering over objects takes fatigue and gets harder with heavy loads, so pathing an effective route through environments and around obstacles is important. Fall damage doesn't just hurt you, that's negligible. It also damages the cargo, and that's unforgivable, so picking a route that minimizes falls is important. Unless, if you brought equipment, you decide to create routes through these obstacles. Maybe a faster route requires putting down just one ladder and climbing up a cliff, or maybe you accidentally climb too high and want to use a rope to go back down. Rivers are another obstacle to consider. In most games, bodies of water aren't even a challenge. You just swim across, or maybe there's a slight current. At best, there might be some kind of whitewater rapid, but usually it's easy to avoid. Whereas in Death Stranding, because the name of the game is moving cargo, you don't even need a rapid flow of water to create some serious problems for yourself. Skyrim mods that had hypothermia mechanics tied to getting wet made river crossings a much more enjoyable challenge. Either ideas are great for really fleshing out the world design of your map. A giant flowing river should be a wall, not just scenery. And Death Stranding goes even further by making snow another consideration. Wading through a foot of snow, slicker surfaces, whiteouts, cold weather affecting stamina drain. Going up a mountain's a challenge of plotting routes and measuring yourself. Going down the mountain's a challenge of controlling your descent speed. I don't think I even need to compare this to Skyrim for it to be clear which game makes climbing that mountain more engaging. And all of what I'm describing is affected by the cargo load and your equipment. There are so many permutations and factors to consider in any decision in Death Stranding that rewards having the actual experience of playing the game up to that point. And what's crazy is that all of what I'm describing stems from a simple fear of just falling over. Such a basic mechanical conceit, and yet it informs so much of the challenge. In most cases, cargo damage really isn't that big a deal. You'll lose some likes, maybe you have to run one more mission to accomplish your goals. On paper, it doesn't matter. But man, does it not feel that way when you play. I've pulled a real delivery driver and boomeranged a package into a wall over less than 10% damage, because hey, if it ain't perfect, might as well. Unlike real delivery drivers, I only get penalized for damage accrued to submitted packages, not your lost cargo. Weather is also a factor, since rain and snow accelerate time, so they rapidly age the container, making them more susceptible to damage from impacts, whereas the weather in most games is just decorative. Death Stranding heavily uses player pride to push people to be better. Norman Reedus is this god in the delivery world right out the gate, so rather than being a nobody who's learning the ropes, you're expected to deliver that talent fast. But the game's also really good at ramping up the challenge slowly. Returning to the starter area after you complete the main area is like revisiting your old school and seeing how small everything is, but felt big when you were there. Important to consider is the role the actual geography plays in this game. The world is sculpted in a way to push players in various directions. Central Region, the bulk of the game's content, is a marvel in world design. The mission structure complements the world design and makes sure the player doesn't explore too much too early, but it also means that each repeat trip just makes the world seem bigger and bigger. Your first run is to visit 3 different people spread out across what initially seems like a big area. Then you make a return trip, and from then on, subsequent outings further push out your boundaries, yet obstacles remain at each step to control you. The most prominent being the mountains, which if I didn't know were explorable, wouldn't have assumed that they were. And it all meshes with the story pretty well. The main thrust of the plot is about reconnecting America and the post-apocalypse through a gradual push west, so structuring the missions in a process of excursions, gradually extending the boundaries, yet controlled by obstacles, is just so good. Yes, the map is a truncated version of the United States, but the world's so destroyed and alien that it really doesn't bother me like with some games that attempt similar world design. The scale of the world is definitely a complicated question, though. I do actually wish the later missions were spread out more to better accentuate that feeling of the world becoming increasingly wild and disparate. Yet I trust the design team to have been thoughtful of that already and to have decided on their format anyways, because it still flows well as is. But a lot of this also relies on the basic loop of package delivery. This is tapping into a style of gameplay I really enjoyed in Metal Gear Solid V, that being to deploy in a corner of the map on free roam and just work my way across, collecting as many materials and items as I can. Usually do this with very little equipment and it can take a couple hours. I've played this save so long that open world soldiers are no longer high enough rank to be worth recruiting, and I have millions of resources. But I still do it because it's fun. Death Stranding tapped into the same feeling but felt less engaging long term and keeping me around. Whereas I can play the phantom pain game of resource harvesting well past the point that I've unlocked everything. I cannot be bothered to keep delivering packages to people once I max out their reputation. The first kind of package delivery is point-to-point. Person A wants something sent to person B. The other kind of delivery is to find lost cargo out in the world and finish its delivery. This was engaging at first because it always meant that there was an expected level of increasing difficulty, or new decisions that had to be made mid-delivery, or I'd just drive around gathering people's lost orders and show up with 50 packages. But the drive gradually went away. I even joked that the worst thing you could do if you actually wanted to get your mail was give Sam his likes. I think part of it is the random distribution of lost cargo. It's basically just sprinkled in a uniform pattern across the map. They do account for areas that are more remote or wouldn't make sense for someone's package to be in, but you can very quickly get a feel for where exactly lost cargo will spawn. Whereas materials placement in Metal Gear Solid 5 is regular and requires time to replenish, so it's a learnable system that you improve with each iterated run-through of an area. But the real problem with the lost cargo in Death Stranding is simply the nonsensical nature of its placement. If lost cargo is supposed to represent, well, lost cargo, then you would think its placement would actually be intentional and thought out, along common and built-up porter routes. It being this ever-replenishing and random, dare I say radiant even, system means that lost cargo is effectively worthless. It's a great but short-term system that loses its luster. We can't say that combination of words without talking about the combat. Yes, indeed. This mail delivery game has combat, but it's mostly supplemental rather than being a core focus, except for parts of the game when it is a focus. Combat's more so about avoiding fighting, but it doesn't stop you from fighting, nor is it particularly bad to dissuade you from doing it. There are many games out there with bad combat that people defend because being bad is supposed to be a narrative point about how There are three main enemy types: guys who want to steal your packages, guys who want to kill you, and ghosts that want to eat you. The second's just a variation of the first with more lethality in mind. However, this is a setting where dead people, if not properly disposed of, create ghosts that can then create large explosions when they eat living people, and this is where the game fumbles. I actually think creating a strong incentive not to just gun down the opposition is an admirable goal in design, but in execution, if all I'm supposed to be scared of when I kill people is more BTs, then we're good. The lack of strength in the BT encounters means the ethical dilemma presented to the player loses its value. If you leave a body in an area where humans operate, either in an enemy camp or near a porter route, then it creates a BT, which in turn eats that human and creates a void out and game over. Not instantly, in fact this can take a while to occur. While I think it's neat that this detail was simulated, dumping bodies in the middle of nowhere was also valid for eliminating that game over risk. Unlike lost cargo, BTs are placed in intentional and learnable locations. I think this is a mistake. Having to contend with more and more BT encounters as a consequence of lethality would better encourage players to try out the myriad of options for dealing with people. That's just working under the assumption of leaving BTs as is. They're definitely the weaker of the two encounters, at least mechanically. I like the notion of an enemy type that you can't see directly. I think the ghost phase works really well, but once you actually get caught, it loses all of its tension. Sam as a character has a built-in respawn mechanic, so the only real threat is to the cargo, not to us. I should mention that missions where the cargo cannot risk being damaged at all are few and far between. And then you have encounters where the game goes too far, that being the Clifford boss battles. This is not a contentious opinion, but it's definitely where Kojimbo's dedication to not letting any of his ideas die in pre-production really stands out even among the fans. These boss battles center around 3 periods of warfare, all of which have plentiful film depictions in American culture. World Wars I and II, as well as Vietnam, because everybody forgot about Korea. Not as many popular war films were made about conflicts post-Vietnam. Thing is, the sequences are not lazy. I was actually surprised by just how good Vietnam looked for this being a video game about the American post-apocalypse set in various alpine tundras. There's a lot of effort for being just the location of a boss battle, but the fights themselves leave a lot to be desired. Sam is finely tuned to work well for the world he's placed in. The mechanics that work well there don't translate to these fights, so you have these goofy sequences of running around collecting itemized cargo that happens to be present so you can ambush the boss, dump your mag into him, and run away. On the one hand, I have to like its rewarding of guerrilla tactics, on the other, it's just tedious. The game is designed around giving the player a set amount of resources to work with when you're out on excursions, so your only recourse when you run out is to have a spare magazine item or grab another weapon. The boss fights seem to forget about spare mags actually being items, and are fairly strange in how they distribute equipment. And then add to that the occasional points where you have to stop everything to rock a baby back to sleep. No, that's not a joke. It's a confused design that seems out of place in this game about package delivery. But if the game was just package delivery, then it wouldn't live up to expectations. You can only get away with that kind of non-conventional focus either if you're extremely niche or an indie title. But because of his legacy, Kojima ended up stuck with the expectations of a AAA game, meaning that you need to have some form of combat. Now, I don't think that's the full picture. I think he wanted his goofy boss battles with a tuned package delivery system, and so these fights are a twisted compromise of ideas. Well, the only reason I'm talking about this is because even though I don't want to talk about it in the story does not stay in its own lane. You will literally get dragged into doing this, and then later in the game it'll forget about that and not auto-assign you the only mission you can do in the final area. Speaking of inconsistency, it's actually surprising how far you can go without ever seeing a game over screen, so when it does happen it can be jarring. Not a complaint, just think that's interesting. But where does Death Stranding start falling apart? I think it's in the construction. Now, I'll be fair here, I love the road construction project, but I think the end result is the world being overdeveloped. It's fun to do, gathering the resources up and delivering them to the unfinished part, and it was a huge motivation for me to get everybody on board with joining the UCA. The real kicker is zipline projects. Ziplines are broken. At the very least, roads make you pay attention while you drive, lest you go over the edges. Ziplines are just waiting to finish the route. Once you have the network down, completing people's reputation grinds is super easy, and since everyone uses ziplines, you'll see random zipline towers in the middle of nowhere that aren't connected to anything, just littering the landscape, which impedes your own network's usability unless you actually go to the effort of tracking down all these errant towers and tearing them down to help clean your network up. Ziplines would be fine if building them was more engaging and there were more downsides to using them. In theory, the big downside is a lowering of cargo capacity over trucks, but in practice, runs are so fast and easy that you could complete a higher volume of runs through a zipline in the time it would take to complete one run with a truck. My obvious balance idea was to limit cargo to just what you would fit inside your backpack, so anything above that had a chance of getting knocked off in the process. It should also take battery power for any ziplines that travel upwards, so there's a bit more method than just saying, yep, it's been 300 meters, time for another zipline. You'd actually have to pace your vertical sections, account for battery loss with generators, and reward ziplines as being downward shortcuts, not entirely routes in themselves. Because the problem is, you can have several interesting route options and mechanical ideas for optimization, but the end all being ziplines invalidates all of that. I don't see why ziplines couldn't just be made to require resource contributions up front, similar to how bridges already do. That way it takes actual effort to build up a network beyond just heading out with 10 small-sized containers and riding back along 10 new zipline towers. Overall, I want to emphasize just how strong Death Stranding was during the duration when the game was all about on-foot package delivery. So when I hear that mobility options in Starfield are basically just a 5-second jetpack with some mild perk upgrades and no land vehicles, you can imagine my lack of excitement. The problem likely aren't with the worlds. The problem is that engaging with the world has not been made a mechanical consideration. Thanks for engaging in what will be one of my shorter projects. I did put a lot of time into Death Stranding, but I intended from the outset to not make this a video about the game's story, because it's nice when a project doesn't become a multi-month ordeal. Thanks to the patrons, there's a lot more of you than I was expecting from the Fallout 76 thing.